The Indian economy is not looking up. Joblessness, price rise, hunger all contribute to poor livelihood that even statistics are not able to hide. Demonetization had taken a toll on the people. Now the COVID pandemic has hit the migrant labor, the poor, the middle class hard. The monetization plan of the government seems to be more of a privatization plan. The farmers are on the roads and have been for 10 months now, agitating against the 3 controversial farm laws, as well as the host of economic problems and issues that beset the nation. The government continues to be in denial mode. So what now?
So welcome, we have with us today well-known economist, former professor of Jawaharlal Nehru University, Prabhat Patnaik, whose articles, essays on economics has been, he's a scholar of international repute, and we are so happy to have you with us today, even though it's a brief and short program. So I wanted to ask you, and really as a layperson, and I'm not an economist, as I always say, and very little understanding of it, but the economy, all the parameters seem to be going all over the place. They're all going downward trend. So if you had to tell us, people who are not from your profession, as it were, what is the state of the economy today in India? How would you put it together?
At the moment, the economy is in an exceedingly bad state. Let us say you look at the first quarter GDP figures, which were brought out by the government just the other day. Now, they show that there is a 20.1% increase compared to the first quarter GDP of last year. All these comparisons are always made on a year-to-year basis. First quarter of last year with first quarter this year. But the point is, the first quarter of last year had seen a 24% drop compared to the first quarter of the previous year. So is totally misplaced, because if you have a fall by 24%, which means, let's say, from 100 you go down to 76, and then you come up 20% over 76, that just brings you up to 90 or so. Therefore, there is actually a 9.2% fall in the first quarter GDP of the current financial year, that means 2021-22, compared to 2019-20.
Right.
Now, 2019-20 itself was a pretty disastrous year, because, unemployment, in other words, pre-pandemic. You see, the pandemic has worsened things, but pre-pandemic, the Indian economy was really doing very badly, because, unemployment in 2019 was in fact at much higher than seen over a period of 45 years at least before that. So you found that 2019-20 was bad. And even compared to that, there is a very sharp drop now.
Right.
So the Indian economy is doing exceedingly
So
bad.
Then the COVID itself, the impact has been so bad that, do you think we're even going to be able to recover from it? And how has it been so bad?
People lost their employment, and because of that, they lost their incomes.
Absolutely.
Everywhere. Even Donald Trump had a $2 trillion rescue package, which is 10% of the GDP of America, which Biden is continuing. Again, another $2 trillion he has put, another 10% of GDP. While in India, there was absolutely no general income transfer. In other words, people lost their incomes, and the government didn't do anything because of the lockdown. The government didn't do anything to compensate them for this loss of income, because of which there was, of course, a drop in consumption as far as the common people were concerned. But even that drop in consumption was sustained. In other words, the consumption that they did undertake was sustained through borrowing. In other words, they just borrowed from
Yeah.
whatever, ran down their cash reserves and so on. Because of which, now what is happening is that even though there is some recovery, that recovery means as incomes come to their hands, they would be paying back loans, they'd be building up cash reserves, they wouldn't be spending as much on consumption.
Yeah.
That's why everybody is actually worried about the fact that consumption is not recovering. And therefore, they keep talking about a V, but they don't mention that the right-hand side of the V has only gone up a little bit, but not the entire length.
When you were speaking just now, it was reminding me a little bit of demonetization and COVID. Now, when demonetization happened and so many people were out of a job, and we had all traveled all over UP, and you could sense the anger, the unhappiness, the frustration. But the people then learned to live with it, and it never got reflected in the votes and in the elections. So the same thing could be, you have so many more people out of jobs now. The government not injecting any impetuous economic incentives into the package. How is this going to work, and why does it work like this?
When people were actually desperately walking back to their villages, there were FIRs filed against them on the grounds that they were violating the COVID norms. So there were FIRs against helpless people. Banks on the fact that it can do all this and get away with it by spreading hate, by spreading communal hatred.
But do you think they think they can get away, or they actually do get away for some reason?
For some time you may be able to get away, but you won't be able to get away all the time, because sooner or later material issues of life then come to the forefront. They come to dominate people's thinking. I mean, for instance, the present agitation, these are very peasants who, after all, had got communalized during the 2013 was a and the division between the Muslims and the Jats in that area had become very sharp. They had actually the same people now are completely against it, because sooner or later people come to realize that this government is not for them. It is really for a handful of.
So Rajesh, Tikayat's speech at this Muzaffarnagar rally, like somebody said, one of the public intellectuals, that is he a leftist, in the sense that privatization and talking against it, I mean, apart from all the points. So I want you to come to that, this whole monetization plan.
Basically, on the one hand, monetization is no different from privatization. Privatization means that you sell an asset once for all into the future. Monetization means that you actually hand it to the private sector for a certain price for, let's say, 30 years, 40 years. At the end of it, you again hand it for another 30, 40 years for a price and so on. So it's a sequence of privatization. The second thing is that this entire business of monetization stroke privatization is really no different from a fiscal deficit in terms of its overall impact. What happens in a fiscal deficit is that you have government bonds being put into private hands and then the proceeds being spent by the government. Here, you have government's physical assets being put into private hands, and the proceeds are going to be spent by the government. So effectively, you are handing over assets to the private sector, which are either government assets or claimed upon the government, and using the proceeds to spend. Now, the problem with this entire monetization privatization business is that when you have handed it over, there is a domain of people's economic rights. Okay, I mean, I'm a citizen. As a citizen, I have some rights. I am a party to the election of the government, which, as it were, is also meant to guard these rights. For instance, I have a right on buying some nominal to go much time I like as I like on the platform of a railway station. The point is that if it's given to a private person, that private person would actually jack up the price so much that it'll exclude me from the use of the platform. So every such privatization or monetization is really shifting assets from a domain where people enjoy them as equals, as citizens, to a domain where inequality is introduced in the use of that asset, depending upon the purchasing power that I have or anybody has. So effectively, the poor people get excluded, and that exclusion is not only a distributional factor, it is also at the same time a denial of a democratic right. It's a disempowerment factor. You know, it's not just economic redistribution. It's a disempowerment factor, and I think people should really raise their voice against it, because it is absurd for the government to actually disempower the people. So, or think of using a road. You know, I mean, everybody has an access to a road, but now that wouldn't be the case anymore, etc. You know, I mean, all these stadium, I mean, anybody has access to a stadium, but now that would be the case. So this is really a very dangerous trend, and it's a trend which is completely unnecessary. And what is more, I mean, the government could have used a fiscal deficit to do exactly the same. And what is more, it is not to revive the economy either, because look, the amounts involved are really fairly trivial, because 6 lakh crores over a 4-year period implies that per year the amount you are thinking of spending as additional to the government's thing is really a very, very small amount. It's nothing which is going to revive the economy given the level of the crisis that we're just talking.
Right. So, you know, this, what you've said, has obviously been picked up at different levels by the farmers, and that whole Muzaffarnagar rally seemed to echo it, and not just from the platform or from the dais, but also farmers who reporters spoke to on the ground. Now, how is this going to impact directly, if we think about it, on the agrarian sector or on the
This Muzaffar, the farmers' agitation.
Yeah.
The farmers' agitation is actually an extremely important event that has really occurred in the last several years. In fact, I would say is the most important event that has occurred since the railway strike of 1974, because such an organized body of people in such a disciplined manner carrying on such a prolonged struggle simply had not happened before. And what is more, it is also, you know, it has a social impact which is really extremely important. This is an area in which the Dalits and the Jats were always having a serious contradiction. But this struggle has brought them together. This is an area of absolute patriarchy. You know, in other words, the entire Jat society used to be a highly patriarchal society, but here you have women coming on to the struggle as equals. So it has had a tremendous and contradiction, which used to be, which was overcome for a very long time. It was revived in 2013 by the BJP, which actually gained from it by it got so many seats and so on. Modi wouldn't have come to power with an absolute majority of the BJP alone, had it not been for the Muzaffarnagar riots, because UP gave them a whole lot of seats. So it's having a social impact which is quite phenomenal, and it's really and it's the first major class action, if you like, since neoliberal measures were introduced in the country. You have had 1-day strikes, 2-day strikes, but this is a real major class action. And this is for the first time also that, the class as a whole and the left, and, they've all come together, which is of great significance. Earlier you never had this happening. You had different peasant groups having their own sectarian positions, while now there is a platform, and the platform has been intact despite all efforts on the part of the government to break it for a very long time. At the same time, I think the issues on which they are fighting are absolutely fundamental issues for the future of our country.
True, absolutely. And they seem to have, in that whole rally, it was very clear. In fact, it was more definitive than one had seen even earlier in the farmers' agitation of this time. A clear understanding of how all this is going to impact on them. I mean, they spoke about rivers, they spoke about land, they spoke about crops, and of course, the laws are there which they are against. So, is there anything that the government can do? Or do you see any indication, and this is really coming to the last part, do you see any indication that the government is interested in doing, in stemming this tide, in creating jobs, in bringing back the economy to some level where it can continue? Maybe it doesn't want a great economy, but it definitely would not want a teetering and a floundering economy, which would impact on the elections, no?
My feeling on the one hand, of course, is that this government has absolutely no understanding of economics, absolutely zero understanding of economics. The second thing is that it has got a few catchwords, shibboleths, and so on. I mean, okay, you are the chief minister, simply get hold of a few hand-picked capitalists, you give them some concessions, and you get them to make some investments, and you think that is the panacea for growth. So, but on the other hand, that is not. I mean, they have zero understanding of what an economy means, what employment requires, what kinds of interventions are required in a situation of crisis. I mean, there is a totality of building a nation, building a society to which economics goes. I mean, into which economics is an input. Economics is not a question of quick fixes. I mean, after all, if you're the government, then you should really be concerned about issues like employment. It's not a question of simply making some promise on Independence Day speeches or something of that kind. You really have to be concerned about it. You really have to do something serious about it. Now, they have absolutely zero understanding.
Now, absolutely the last question, joblessness, of course, is a huge issue. And it also impacts on what would be, what would you say, the force multiplier, and you get all those unemployed youth to feed into various organizations, to polarize, to create hate, and all can be bought for a few rupees. Now, we've seen this earlier also in electoral politics, how this unemployed force is used by politicians and political parties very callously during elections and around elections. And now you find that this is a further exploitation. So maybe joblessness is something they don't really even want to settle. And I want you to, I mean, that's of course a slightly cynical argument, but I also want you to talk a little bit on how bad it is and how much worse it's going to get for us and for our young and our new generations.
I mean, the way I see it is that, I mean, there is a struggle which has been on since independence, before independence, between, let us say, modernity, secularism, democracy, and all these values in our country, and the traditional patriarchal, feudal, kind of socially retrogressive mindset on the other. While you had Gandhi, Nehru, the entire freedom struggle, anti-colonial struggle, the left, the secular parties and so on, they really all had a certain consensus around the first. I think that struggle is still going on. And I think in that struggle, I mean, I think I think the struggle against the BJP is really a carrying over of that struggle. And that's why what's happening to the peasant struggle now, I mean, that the focus of that struggle now has come to the peasantry. And mind you, the peasantry is a crucial force. Gandhiji mobilized the peasantry against British colonialism. So the peasantry is a very powerful force, and to the extent that the peasantry holds firm, and the peasantry can actually become a carrier. Mind you, it wasn't always like this, but the more this struggle lasts, the more it becomes a carrier of the values of modernity, coming from a Jat kind of
Really
traditional
amazing.
patriarchal background. It's quite amazing. So the struggle itself has a kind of revolutionizing role, and I see the future of the country being determined by that. That to the extent that we can actually have the peasants holding firm and kind of winning that struggle, we would also be able to build a new India. In other words, after the peasant struggle, I feel far more optimistic about the future of our country than I used to do before that, when it appeared that there was nothing to hold this juggernaut
Together. Okay. Thank you so much. This was very
Thank
interesting,
you.
actually. Thank you. Take care. So there you have it. We had Prabhat Patnaik really explaining the economy and how we are going downwards rather than up. The graph is really not what it should be. The issues of joblessness, of excessive privatization, which is basically this monetization program, price rise, everything is hitting livelihood and the citizen of India. Whether the citizen reacts to this and how he or she reacts to it remains to be seen in terms of electoral politics, because we are going into elections, assembly elections in the coming year in 5 crucial states, which are all impacted by all these issues. And we'll see how it all pans out. Thank you so much.